Welcome, everyone. I'm Jack Glassman, chair of that committee since 2012, and I'm also historical architect for the National Park Service regional office. So this is our final meeting before our summer recess in August. So let's just jump right into a couple of interesting items, current events, items of note. Let's start with some good news that after like, I don't know how many years, it's since like 1978 or something, the proposal to make Roxbury's Highland Park with a huge range of historic resources, natural and cultural, and Fort Point at Tower. It's now finally an architectural conservation district. So congrats for all of those, the long time efforts. It's a special status that helps, as I'm reading one of the stories, that helps protect the neighborhood amid intense development pressure. And since most of us know it's an architectural conservation district, it's its own sort of animal. It's not as restrictive in terms of changes as the Beacon Hill sort of historic district, and yet at the same time it does give some sort of public and citizen kind of review and guidance to changes. Over in JT along the Arborway, there was something else I think that had been planned for a long time, the Franciscan Monastery of St. Clair, the St. Clair, what do they call them, the Poor Clair nuns plan to sell this landmark building. They initially had talked about demolishing it, but there was huge pushback in the neighborhood in the city.
I live there. I live right down the street.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So the area, I guess it's still early on in the planning, and it'll be redeveloped, but the intention now is to incorporate the building, the main building would be incorporated. So, stay tuned for that. Down in New Haven, the Pirelli, as it was known, it was the Armstrong Rubber, and then the Pirelli Tire building, vacant for at least 20 years, has been reinvented as the Hotel Marcel. I can't wait to visit. Go see it. It was Marcel after the architect Marcel Breuer. The space between the upper and lower was ostensibly to divide like the administrative, the corporate offices from other, but it also, as you can see with the raised highway, the expressway, it allowed view through, because that was the level of the New Haven with its highway systems coming through. And as commentators and historians have discussed, it's sort of a different type of brutalism than say, the Yale Art and Architecture building. It's a little more harsh. But in any case, the other amazing news about it is that the hotel is a net zero. When it's net zero, it's got solar panels on the roof that supply, I guess, all of its power and enough to actually at times sell back to the grid. So I love the sculptural quality of it itself.
Who's doing the redevelopment?
Let's see. Well, I know that, so the architectural firm was Becker, Bruce Redmond Becker.
That works.
In terms of all right. I'm just looking at the Globe story. I don't recall, mentioned the development team. I probably should have, but anyway, yeah, they're looking for the LEED Platinum status and Passive House certification. Some of you guys know much better than I. So next up was the sales. There was a lot of concern over the last couple of months, and Governor Baker was really fast-tracking selling the Hines Convention Center that would help finance expanding the South Boston one, Exhibition Convention Center. So there was news a week or two ago, I guess, that that's been postponed, and the Senate, the Mouse Senate, I guess they sort of put the brakes on that and said, let's, get it studied and get more, take a look at all of the pros and cons. And hopefully that would include saving, at least some of the existing, retaining some meeting space. That's just certainly enlivened the Back Bay. There was like a couple of days ago an update to that. I think it had to do with the Massachusetts House. So it may not be that it's pushed off all the way until like 2024, and maybe more, just like a year, but they're basically trying to be a little more deliberate, I guess, about it, and not just have something that was rushed through before the governor's term ends. Another one to stay tuned on. Next to, immediately adjacent to the Charlestown Navy Yard, the Hoosac Stores Warehouse. This is one I disappointed to hear the news that where it's a master redevelopment plan, really focused for the Navy Yard, the Boston National Historical Park, had focused on a very, maybe too ambitious plan to repurpose the building as the main security checkpoint for visitors to the Constitution, the visitor center, the Constitution Museum, and curatorial offices, administrative offices upstairs. So it was a lot to ask for one building that has a lot of big columns and not that high floor-to-floor height. On the other hand, I guess whatever the recommendations from the A&E team and the GSA were, that it just couldn't be done. So having tried that ambitious plan, now they're saying they're proposing to demolish the building and to do new construction, I guess, for the visitor center. So, the thing about this side, this is sort of like the last remaining part of the industrial waterfront of Charlestown that faces the river. It's obviously the opposite side of the neighborhood, but with all of its connections, this was Hoosac Stores because of its connection to the Hoosac Tunnel and to the rails. Really had this was the harbor connecting to New York State and the interior of the country by rail. And of course, there's the Tudor along this area was the famous Tudor Wharf and the Frederick Tudor, the Ice King. So this is the last of what used to be several grain silos and warehouse buildings. So anyway, that's for public comment now. Down in Manhattan, the Lever Building. Just all of us probably who studied architecture would have come across this at least once in our sort of early architectural history courses. It's an iconic, 1952 Skidmore, Owings and Merrill Lever House building. It was built with glass and steel when most of the buildings in the area were still heavy masonry. So it was immediately stood out. One press release in '52 billed it as the answer to problems of modern city planning. It's a nice article. Actually, this was from Time magazine, I think, about the story. It was crafted nicely, I think. The article talking about what's the problem in aging landmarks, the opportunity, a loving restoration, as they call it, for a new era of work. And so the restoration, I'm sure it's going to work on the skin and the plazas, but the new era of work is to have the sort of communal, as they hope that people will be returning to the office, but fresh air, lots of natural light, outdoor access, these trends that, as the article says, it started before COVID, but have become even more important as a result of the pandemic. So on-site dining, concierge service, health and wellness spaces. I did the caption here, proposed lobby cafe, but maybe it's sort of a little bit more than that, sort of rereading their concept of this. Lots of the Lever Club is one of the main amenities. So it's a hospitality space on the third floor that'll be shared among tenants, recreation rooms. So anyway, the work, I guess, it's about a third of the way done. And Waterman Clark, as the developer, doing that. I just wanted to sort of a shout out to Some Architect magazine and Carbon Positive, a story by Carl Elefante, who, as many of us know, he was the architect. He coined the term about the greenest building as the one that's already there, and he's acknowledging all the great progress that's been made in the architectural profession with energy and conservation, net zero, and sort of pushing because of the huge building stock, existing buildings, saying we need to reach zero emissions. We have to eliminate the existing carbon footprint of the building sector and transform the performance of existing buildings. So there's an article in Architecture magazine has a couple of references to some existing books, and a forthcoming one called The Building Reuse Practice Guide, supporting climate action, and some other things. So the conclusion is no pathway to a zero emissions building sector without zeroing out emissions from America's approximately 325 billion square feet of existing buildings. And he wraps up the article just talking about this also as a designer and architect, how rewarding, which I certainly would agree with, how rewarding it is to tackle the existing and react to it and figure out creative ways to solve the problem. And now for something completely different. So the only doghouse that Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed, here is a picture of it. Wright had done a house in San Rafael. I think it was in San Rafael, but that's where the model is on permanent display now at the Marin County Civic Center. That was Frank Lloyd Wright's largest building, and this one was the smallest. And so he had done a commission for the Burgers couple house, and their 12-year-old son wrote a handwritten letter. I have it here, and if anyone can see. Dear Mr. Wright, and he talked about his dog Edward, but they called him Eddie, and would it be possible for him to design this house? And Wright wrote back that he was busy at the moment, but that he would, when he had time, he would send a design, and he did on the back of an envelope, sent it off. And later they put it off, and then later built it, and then it got over the years it was destroyed, and then the young boy Jim, his brother, I think he was off fighting in the war or something. They rebuilt the version, and it's now was donated. So there it is, and reportedly the roof leaks, just like a typical rank building. Wright had recommended using surplus materials from the house. I don't know if the original one did have that. So this was kind of an interesting story that kind of talks about certainly the passage of time and different discoveries and interpretations, but the Coliseum in Rome, of course, we think about the ancient times, the Romans, and the not totally true, I guess, or overblown thing about the gladiators and all that may or may not have happened in a big way. But anyway, the Coliseum also had this long history, really, as Christian, as a church and as sort of a pilgrimage, sort of in the later time. And from that era, just over a doorway, and had been so faded, no one had noticed it until recently. There was this map, so they think it was from the 17th century, but it's showing ancient Jerusalem. So from whatever records they then had, and it's a map, which really reinforces, of course, the connection of the Coliseum then being used as really as a sort of a holy site of the church.
The cross is there.
I know in the bottom left, isn't that great?
Yeah. Calvary.
Crosses on the bottom
Lower
left?
left.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some figural aspect to that. Unless that's, I didn't actually, I haven't actually looked at how that
Yeah.
worked with my recollections of the layout of the city, but which way is more north, and that would have been all the old city at that point, I guess, but anyway, so that's what I have. Some others will time permit, but I'm going to stop. Actually, we'll stop sharing, but I want to just that one, and not sure what that is. So David, why don't we'll bring you
Yes, please.
up. Here. Bear with me.
Green. That's,
Sharing pause.
do that part.
This is looking different.
Of course. Nothing ever works just the way, or it never works the way it worked.
I think maybe on the right, go down, where the little gear is, the
Yeah.
second next to it, just to the left. The one that's just.
Oh, the open.
Is that might be the
Oh,
little screen
okay.
right there, there we go.
All
That
right,
might be good.
good. Okay. And we'll, for controls, can you, like, Dan, you're saying is the sharing working at the moment?
No, so Jack, what you need to do right now, you're sharing a PowerPoint and I think you want to go to a PDF, is that correct?
We're now in the PDF.
Yeah, but
Right.
you're still sharing a PowerPoint. So what you need to do is go back down to stop sharing and reshare
Okay.
because you're
select the right
sharing the
screen.
program, not the screen.
Yeah.
All right. So stop share. And just. Is there a-
And then share and then find that presentation.
Oh, okay.
That would be it right there.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. All right.
There you go.
All right.
And open to full.
Here. Yeah, it does look like the interface looks different than it did before. But,
By doing the upper right full view. That works.
okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. There we go.
Right, you want to hand me that,
Yeah, if you want to click off, X out of that bar at the top, because we're all seeing that and it's a little distracting.
Oh,
Yeah, there you go, thanks.
thank you. And
All right.
and the
Thanks,
keyboard
Jack.
Switched on.
David Torrey here, Torrey Architecture. Susan Schur has been doing these conferences on different materials, and there was a great one planned for the use of plastics in architecture. It suffered from COVID. So first it had to be delayed a year, and then it turned into a virtual. But I had offered to do a poster session. I'm trying to advance to the next slide. Of course, it's not doing what it did a minute ago.
Maybe the arrow. There we go.
All right, this is not like what I would have helped. Right, so I did a poster of polymeric materials and the restoration of lost architectural details. My statement on this is the unfortunate loss of a building's exterior architecture detail diminishes the architectural expression of its original design, thereby depriving the public of the full richness of its historic and cultural legacy. The monitoring and maintenance of elevated facades and roof areas is often deferred due to costly or risky access conditions. When insufficient maintenance is combined with the constant weathering of building materials at elevated exposures, deterioration of building elements can be exacerbated to the point of removal by building owners faced with high repair and replacement costs. Replication using original materials requires skills and raw materials often unavailable in today's construction industry. resulting in high material and labor costs. These conditions favor the use of alternative materials and methods to heal the injuries of time and decay. Durable composite materials can cost-effectively be used to replace and recreate missing wood, metal, and masonry elements for low-maintenance, long-term architectural restoration. Presented here are case studies using modern composites to illustrate the return of these buildings' original stylistic attributes and appealing character-defining features. So that's my little polemic on use of GFRP, because you often, it's hard to get at these places. Now, this is a project that my firm, Mandatory Spencer, now Tory Architecture, did in Copley Square for this now the Brookline Bank building. And notice the spandrel panels between the windows. This had been redone in a somewhat ghastly way. The left part was overlaid, but now we uncovered the original copper spandrel panels between double hung windows. And notice that what's interesting is the copper panel is imitating wood. So what we did was imitated the wood imitating the copper panels by creating actual castings of the original copper wood panel system in GFRP. This was done to make the spandrel panels in a redo of that building, which stands proud today, restored to its close to original, but we did a new entrance, and a lot of different things happened on the building. This next one, First Unitarian Universalist Society, Newton, Mass. Existing masonry found to be deteriorated beyond repair was removed for safety and used to model molds for replication of original balustrade and pinnacles in GFRP. And here it is being hoisted up. You might not have known this when you're driving by on the Pike, but this project with Judy Selwyn oversaw and Durafiber in New Hampshire built actually recreated everything above that sort of gutter line is GFRP and the rest is masonry. So that's a nice, really good use, and I use that as an example on my next project. Now, this building everybody knows.
Do you know what the framework is that,
Up in there, there's some steel framing there, mounted to the masonry, yeah. But otherwise, those pinnacles are self-standing. See these pieces in the shop? And they just get screwed together very easily. They're very flexible, and they put the joint lines in it. This building here, notice the bottom, which we saw when I originally moved to Boston, and then here it is, the older picture with those pinnacles and balustrade. Notice how it's lost a lot of its character, but with Feingold and Alexander's project and the revitalization of this building, there goes the new balustrades cast, and ta-da, there it is, with all its glory, even with the flagpoles. And
where's the company that's doing the casting?
This was done, FiberTech in Greenville, South Carolina, did the GFRP work on that. And I talked to Mr. Alexander about this, and he lent me these photos to show. Also, this one is another one of their projects. This is the postcard of the Worcester train station, which looked sad and highly pixelated before the renaissance of this building happened. Here's this big old steel framework, ta-da, the towers are back.
Wow.
And what a difference that makes.
GFRP.
That's all GFRP on just a thin steel. The stuff is about a 1/4 inch thick. On a much, much smaller scale, in Canton, Mass., there's a lovely little church, the Unitarian Church of Canton, First Parish. Notice the balustrades, and notice the spire and the curved little drum, the connection between the drum and the spire, and all those pinnacles and balustrades. Sadly, when we arrived, this is a Tory architecture job finished a couple years ago, where there's a project to restore the spire. And so phase 1 was accomplished. So the 38 hurricane stripped a lot of the original building forms off, because as I say, that how can a church afford to paint this wood stuff? It's like any balustrade. So, and they did sort of a muddled job of it. But we looked back at old photos and we created what we should be doing. So circa 2019, that was the goal. It's going to be circa future to finish all the pinnacles. But in that 2018 version, what we did was we decided that if you're going to rebuild and recover it, don't just strip the shingles and put more shingles on. That's going to require constant maintenance. Let's do GFRP. And notice the spire framing goes right through, and that was in pretty good shape. So what happened was, notice the spire framing and shafting going through. So we designed the drum and the spire in the original curved transition shape there. They stripped the thing and then nervously dropped this hat over the top of the original framing, including the weather vane rod. So this is, Dura Fiber helped us with this project, and American Steeple were the guys who got that on there. So that was First Parish, Canton, Mass, and that's the first phase of restoring, and now you don't have to worry about that. The paint sticks extremely well to GFRP. You can use a material as the first resin base, but the paint, it'll be white forever, and then it takes paint very easily. On a much smaller scale, here's a balustrade at an entrance to a house in Hingham. Actually, it was relocated to Hingham as a historic sea captain's house. And notice the little balustrade, those turned balusters over the entrance. When we got to this house in Hingham, you see the balustrade on the roof just looks like a garden gate fence, inappropriate and inaccurate. So we went back to historic documents, and we also took the dimensions of the balusters that didn't survive, extrapolated that up, and now the new Widow's Walk in the original design is of the same, notice the turned balusters, and this is in spectus, which is a form of plastic.
So they're
there it
custom,
is.
they're custom.
Custom-made balusters, right, and it's pretty easy. You make a mold and you make a lot of them. Within Susan Scher's compendium of all the, what would have been the conference, there was a preservation brief, which we should all know about, number 16, use of substitute materials, and it has several pages. This is the bottom half of this page is the fiber reinforced polymers page, advantages, disadvantages. In the same book, Charles Sullivan, who's the director of the Cambridge Historical Commission, wrote a piece, and you might think that historical commissions are totally against using non-original materials, but he has a piece which notice the wood grain of white pine, old white pine and new white pine at the bottom of the page, and then issues with these things. Do you ever find look for an original balustrade on a colonial house? It's really hard to find them because of all those reasons. But so historical commissions are able to, for instance, there's the gutter profiles. You can get a fiberglass gutter that holds a lot more water and has the same exact profile and doesn't rot. So coming back to Cambridge, staying in Cambridge, this is the view opposite Harvard Yard of the church that was tied with Harvard, and that's where Harvard's graduation, where Harvard actually paid for some of the construction, part of the construction of this First Parish Church in Cambridge. If you wondered if it sort of stands out to you as a little funny looking, it's because originally it was a Gothic Revival beauty with pinnacles, balustrades, octagonal corner buttresses, buttresses up the side, pinnacles on the eaves, running balusters. And as Tory Architecture was commissioned to restore the exterior, which is in bad need of work, there are extant portions of this building. Now, Isaiah Rogers in 1833 designed First Parish using high-tech bandsaws in wood. In 1833, old-growth wood was a plentiful resource in New England. It was skilled craftsmen, able to saw it into boards and piece it together into forms evocative of stone. Early Gothic Revival did not rigorously copy carved stone European Gothic examples, as did later 19th century work by, say, for instance, Viollet-le-Duc. Instead, First Parish was the traditional New England early Gothic Revival wooden meeting house, just decorated in a purely New World interpretation of the Gothic style. Flat boards cut in curved 2D profiles, sometimes called gingerbread or carpenter Gothic, were intended to present a silhouette without the need for sculpted carvings. Should a sufficient budget have been available, this is what I was thinking in terms of modern days. If he had had a big budget, maybe Rogers might have designed and built this in limestone, but instead painted wood, achieved his desired effect, and was quickly realized. So today, a similar quandary presents itself to First Parish Church. The cost in today's construction market to obtain durable wood species and hire skilled woodworkers to accurately restore First Parish in wood is hard to imagine within a justifiable construction budget. And then think about protecting the painted wood from the elements, ongoing maintenance, continued vigilance. But with durable materials and methods are available to cost effectively restore the beauty of First Parish for the long term, we are recommending that they restore First Parish, not to 1956, but to 1833. So how did we accomplish? We have drawings and we are ready to do this should funds be available. So everyone knows that the Sanders Theater Tower Memorial Church was replaced and by some person related to Harvard. So we're hoping that someone related to Harvard will come in and say, this is definitely a profile we want to return when you walk out of gates of Harvard Yard. And we've had this, we designed the thing and estimated. Here's what's so here's how we did it. Notice these are pictures of what remains and what did remain of the church. And they even rebuilt the thing. There's steel in the tower. These are 1940s scaffolding work when they restored it. And then, sadly, hurricanes. In the lower left, you can see the results of Hurricane Carol and another one in the 50s. Two of those spires ended up in the burial ground. And so then the church suffered the indignities of both hurricanes and Harvard modernism because the modernists said, let's just lop it off and take off the corner octagonal pilasters and remove those Victorian decorative pinnacles. But a lot of part of it's remained. So this was, first we did, we had existing conditions come out and do their laser scanning. So for the first time, we can actually measure the dimensions, overlay on a 3D model, and carefully recreate the entire building in CAD as it was, accurately enough to actually be approved by Charles Sullivan and the Cambridge Historical Commission to go ahead with this project, which is a combination of accessibility, a new entrance door with ramps, and restoring the original building to its former glory. Notice the strength of the tower with those four corner buttresses rather than this sleek, thin thing. You can see where they lopped them off. There's lines lifted over. So we were able to do the comparing of photos and three-dimensional modeling and actually draw this thing to be restored. And all it takes is a thin armature, and you strap on this skin on an armature. And we think it would make quite a wonderful return to the skyline of Harvard Yard. That's the story of that project, and so we're looking for funding.
Bravo.
Yeah, very exciting.
All right.
It's a great presentation, very interesting.
Thank you.
Very.
Shall I go?
I just want to jump back on with because I had some of the projects that's sort of inspired by, well, all right. I was sort of inspired by David's work. There was a little church, little thing I did that I wanted to show, but okay. Thank you, I guess, Matt. Matthew, stop the share.
Yeah, Jack, did you want me to go? I've got a hard stop at 9, or do you want to go now?
Oh, I see. Yep. Carry on. Yeah, Matthew,
Okay.
why don't you share? I forgot about that. Thanks.
Okay.
For reminding me.
So I just wanted to share my rather geeky love of stone paving and talk a little bit about that. So historic stone street paving. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So kind of the trajectory of my own geeky love of this. Years ago in the late 80s, I was educated as a civil engineer and worked as a highway engineer for my first couple years out of school, mostly assessing and designing repaving projects on the Mass Turnpike. And then since I joined SGH in the mid-90s till now, I've done a lot of stone paving design over the years, although most of it hasn't been vehicular. It's mostly been pedestrian or occasionally light vehicular, a lot of university and college plazas and terraces and balconies and things. And kind of during that time, about a dozen years ago, when I spent a year in Italy, as part of the studies, the independent studies I did over there, I looked at a lot of different stone pavings. There were just so many different systems in the streets of Rome and surrounding towns and piazzas. So that was kind of a fun way for me to geek out while I'm there. And just a bit on terminology, because so many things get called cobblestones that really aren't. So cobbles and cobblestones, as you see at the left, are really natural stones, uncut and just shaped as they come out of the ground, which around here in New England is mostly rounded, kind of glacial till or water rounded. And then what you often see in places like Lowell and Lawrence and Soho, as pictured here, is Belgian block. So rectangular on the face and really a brick-like volume, brick shaped or larger in a lot of cases. At the lower right, essentially a square face and a cubic volume are sets. And on the upper right are flags, and those can be either, square or rectangular on the face or even irregular, but, a very thin relative to their surface area. And for that reason, those are typically used only for pedestrian and not for vehicular paving. They're just too prone to cracking under wheel loads with that flexural load. So those are kind of the most common terms around here. There are other types of paving you see in other parts of the world. But a couple summers ago, I had the good fortune to really dive into this love and do a little study in the summer on the historic cobblestone Main Street in Nantucket Island. So it was essentially over the years that had periods of ups and downs where, they spent very little on the streets and they were really well laid and their maintenance costs were really low, and they were kind of bragging about how little they cost compared to bituminous. Alternating with times when they were just complaining, oh, these cobblestone streets have got to go. They're just such a pain. No one can keep them up. No one knows how to deal with them anymore. So I worked with them, with the Community Foundation of Nantucket a couple summers ago on this. One of Sarah Wormill's students, Hillary Hedges Rayport, was really a great resource and had really done a lot of research on the street. So kind of the green bullets here are the up periods where they're really proud of just how well these streets hold up to traffic and how little they have to spend on them compared to the bituminous streets and the red or down periods. So they're kind of at the end of a down period now. They're hearing a lot of these complaints. People are wondering, gee, is it just really practical to keep these streets up, et cetera, et cetera. So, part of this was kind of on-site assessment, and part of it was technical literature search. And kind of one of the interesting things is in this period of about 1870 to 1910, there was really good engineering research and publications coming out of US universities and also kind of Italian, English, Irish, on, how do you really do stone pavings and how do you make it hold up to vehicular loads? And, so this is in an age before bituminous concrete pavements are widespread. So that's really where the engineering research in the day was going. And there are some great publications. I'm showing a couple Italian examples here, looking at, what are the ideal dimensions of these and kind of aspect ratios for even what are cobbles that you're picking up out of the ground, but carefully selecting them for the ones that are going to work best, and how to set these. So this was from a more recent English paper where they reset this cobble paving at Radcliffe Square, Oxford. It had failed pretty badly. They reset it improperly at first, and then they realized that people were kind of laying those, imagine those stones on the right are kind of baked potato shaped. They were laying them flat and not driving them in vertically, which from everything I'd seen in Italy and what I'd seen from older properly set cobblestone pavements here in New England, that's how you have to install them exactly as shown there, driven in vertically and every cobble tight to the one around it. So even though you don't see that on the surface, subsurface, they're all in contact. So wheel load on one, especially as a wheel is spinning and it's trying to torque that cobble out of the ground, if they're in isolation, if they have kind of sand or mortar all around them, that one stone is the only one resisting that force. But if they're all in contact with each other, it gets spread to the 5 or 6 adjacent to it, and then the 10 or 12 adjacent to that, and those stresses are distributed over a much larger area. And there's also the kind of, a lot of research into what's the ideal setting and dressing material. So here in this nice English diagram, you see all these layers identified. That very top layer, which the English call a Hagen dressing often, the very top layer, is difficult, as you can see, because its geometry doesn't key it in at all. It just wants to come out. So how do you get the ideal material that's actually going to stay in there? And typically they've used a mixture of sand, clay, and gravel. So materials and soils that we would define as a mixture of cohesive materials like clay with non-cohesive materials like sand. The non-cohesive materials drain better, but the cohesive materials kind of hold together better. So they're kind of creating the Goldilocks material, the perfect material, out of combining those cohesive and non-cohesive materials. And traditionally what was used on Nantucket was their local dirty sand. And what you mean by dirty is it isn't just a wash clean sand like you would get at the beach. It's the sand that you dig a hole in Nantucket and you kind of find this everywhere. So it's sand that's actually mixed with and combined with some amount of clay or silt. And digging back into these, turn of the century volumes and engineering research, that's exactly what they were recommending. So Morrison in 1908 and Tilson, a really great handbook from 1900. And these are university professors. I think Tilson was from Columbia in New York City. We're saying what you really want is loamy sand. And so looking up loamy sand is defined on the kind of classic USDA soil triangle. Any soil, what you dig up in your yard or what your potting soil, you can kind of simply classify this way. Each of the 3 points would be 100% of either sand, clay, or silt. And then any point on that triangle is some combination of those. So looking up, well, what did loamy sand mean in 1900 or 1908? Well, it was essentially 70 to 85% sand, 10 to 15% clay, and the remainder, if any, 0 to 20% was silt. So again, it's mostly sand because drainage is really important in roads, but it's enough of the cohesive stuff to kind of hold it together and stick it together. And actually that helps make it compactable as well, which is a key thing. So some of the problems on Nantucket on Main Street where they've had problems have been, you can see their detail here from some of their recent specifications for the town are actually pretty good. Look, they're showing them kind of like baked potatoes or molars. They're driven in vertically like they should be. They even show them touching. So the spec looks pretty good. They're using stone dust instead of a dirty sand. Stone dust it compacts really well, but it does not drain well. And they weren't really installing it this way. So you can see over here on the left where they've had all these cobbles spun out. First of all, they're not always picking the right ones. It should be like a baked potato. It shouldn't be shaped like a cantaloupe. And a lot of these are just kind of perfectly spherical, and those tend to spin out. And in the top photo, you can see this is an older area that was set really well and that's held up really well. And actually, a lot of these are flat topped, which they used to find on the island. They know exactly where to get the long stones that were kind of flat topped. And on the bottom, this more looks like the sea of icebergs. So not only does it look terrible and non-historic because the kind of stone to fill ratio is way off, but just by looking at that, you can see that subsurface, these aren't going to be in contact, right? So they're going to spin out a lot easier as someone turns their wheel. All the force is going to be isolated on that single stone. So kind of just to wrap up, so my findings down on Nantucket, cobblestone streets, kind of the world of paving and AASHTO and federal highways, all streets, even your local roads, tend to fall into two categories: rigid paving, like concrete, or flexible, like bituminous concrete, which a lot of people would call asphalt, even though asphalt is just the binder in it. And stone streets are really like a hybrid. They're, extremely rigid individual units and surface, but the joints between them actually give them a lot of the characteristics of a flexible pavement where it can accommodate, subtle areas of settlement and tree roots and things like that, and kind of, roll with those punches. And most of all, they're pervious, so that if you pick the right material between them, like a dirty sand as opposed to a stone dust, they really drain water well. So that's, in my mind, a reason we should be thinking about these today is just the sustainability of having pervious pavements. And they can withstand contemporary vehicular wheel loads. All the research and the European research supports that. The surface is actually more rigid than bituminous. The capacity is really all about the subbase. How are the subbases chosen, the layers, and how well are they compacted? And that's really where the ability to support wheel loads comes from. And then the most significant load that was displacing cobbles there was really the torque from turning wheels. And the absolute worst case is when someone parallel parks, because when you're moving and turning, like slowly taking a left turn, that's not so bad. But when a car is totally stationary and you've got all the weight sitting there and someone cranks the wheel really hard to one side to get out into or out of a parallel parking spot and the car's not moving, you're concentrating it all on a couple stones or even a single stone right underneath the wheel. So that was it. So I'll stop the share and let you get back to it, Jack.
Great.
Thanks,
Wow. Cool.
Yeah, just a quick question. My understanding is that cobbles were often used as ballast aboard ships in, 17th, 18th century. And so in Nantucket, might it be that some of those were, so the ballast would be, after the load was, they were emptied and to make up for that. But is it possible some of those imported or?
That story persists a lot, and kind of everywhere we keep hearing, oh, these came over as ballast from ships from England or everywhere else. But you look at those stones and they are all just the local New England glacial till. So I think there's a lot of mythology about that. The physical evidence just doesn't support it.
All right. All right, thank you. Well, good to know. I know that there's a park in Charlestown, that has ostensibly cobbles that came off of the ship, but I don't know if that was embellished as well.
Yeah, I think if we see flint anywhere, we'll feel pretty good that probably came over on a ship from England.
All right. So, Dan from AHA, Dan Lidar, you're on.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Lidar scanning of an historic building. And where this starts is, John Dalzell and a bunch of people from Boston have a thing called the Green Building Mountaineering Club. I started going up to Berlin, New Hampshire. And when I was in Berlin, which in New Hampshire we call Berlin, I found an old house. This is when COVID started. And the house, when I opened up I bought the house. This was the house. You see that? Am I getting the right screen up there? And when I was inside the house, I found this, which is original blueprint from Francis Fassett, who was the designer of that Baxter Library and many of the grand old hotels, because Berlin at one time was a very thriving city, and they brought the best architects they could find. And for those of you who may not have heard of Fassett, he had an intern named John Calvin Stevens, and John Calvin Stevens eventually became a partner in the firm. And this particular house had the same family living in it since it was built. Like this says that it's for John Perkins by Francis Fassett and Thompson. And when I bought the house, there were turnings. Let's see if this will pop up. I got to get my screen going right here. There were turnings.
We're not seeing
Excuse me,
your.
Dan, what we're looking at is the old library, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see. Do I have to do the stop share and share again? Maybe. So when I got the house, speaking of balustrades, the leftover turnings from this original railing were here. And everything was exactly the way the house had been for 130 years. Do you see that detail there?
Yeah.
So I decided that I would apply for historic preservation status for the house, and I wanted to get obviously full measured drawings of the house. So do you see this 3D model on the screen?
No, not yet.
I apologize. So basically if all of you have an iPhone 12 or later who have an iPad, there's an app called Canvas. And Canvas allows you to use the Lidar function, which is what does the facial recognition. And you walk through a building and do a scan, and then it exports as a point mesh. And then the company, Occipital, will export it back to you for 15 cents a square foot as a full measured drawing. And I'm having a little bit of difficulty with my Zoom screen here, but this export allows you to measure, and it's exactly the scale. And that's not really the outstanding part about it, although this was extremely useful to me. And this, by the way, the app itself is free. And actually behind me, you can see these tall wooden doors. This is the room I'm sitting in. In fact, right behind my head, that's that door right there. And this is accurate within about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch everywhere. And then I'm going to again try to switch screens. It exports into a Revit file. So, and I'm no great expert with Revit, but you're then able to create from that model a full Revit, AutoCAD, and SketchUp model of the building. And I thought, wow, this is really convenient for me, because I want to be able to go through these, and I have photos of the interior, but it's a perfect match to the building as is. And in fact, if you think of that original drawing that I showed you, the dimensions all line up. And so it's a pretty interesting workflow. And what it takes maybe an hour and a half to walk through the building and do a scan. And in fact, I will give you an example of one. And by the way, yeah, all the other presentations were fantastic, guys. Thank you. I've been involved with BSA for a decade, and I didn't know this group existed. So let's see, share screen again.
Yeah.
You seeing that model right there, the scan?
The model.
No, what you should be seeing right now is, let me try it again.
It's the.
The photo.
Yeah, we're showing the interior that looks like a photo panorama.
Yeah, so this is done with the software, okay? And in fact, you walk through, and I have lots of links, but I realize time is of the essence here. There's the mantle in the house, and an interesting, I showed this to somebody before, but you can see the painting on the mantle, and then the hand painting around the top. And then if I were to go back to my 3D version, and I think while I'm bringing that up, I want to mention that the entire city of Berlin, New Hampshire is full of these old Victorian buildings. And it was this is the new master plan, which we've just developed. But there are houses like this that are magnificent old Victorian homes that sell for $50,000 to $60,000. Some of them are being given away. Yeah, because everybody left because there was no economy. And I want to get back to that room that we were just looking at in the 3D. And I think I know what I need to do. I need to move this to this screen. Now you see the 3D model. And so it just blew my mind. And there you go. See the mantle in there?
Yeah.
And in fact, when I came back and field checked this, these are accurate. I mean, the dimension of this outlet is actually in the room. And so, and by the way, part of how they're doing this is they take the point mesh, which the Lidar generates, and I could show that to you if you had time to see it. And they export it to people in Ukraine, interestingly enough. And so they're Revit modelers and are able to, they're very careful about it. And I was impressed when I looked at the layout of the, like I went through the attic, which I used a New Hampshire Saves program to insulate with closed cell foam. But this layout of the rafters is completely accurate. And I had a photograph for you, this back staircase that you'll show up here. It's a little bit tricky moving it around. You'll see a back staircase there. And let's see. There's that back staircase, and it came out perfect in the CAD model. So I think this is a very affordable and very useful tool for making measured drawings of historic structures.
Oh, cool. That's canvas?
It's canvas by Occipital, and it also generated, it's not particularly beautiful, and I don't have the SketchUp running. So when they give you the file back, you get Revit, AutoCAD, and SketchUp. And I have links to the company. I spoke to them about this presentation, and they have a, let's see if I can land on this real quick. Sorry, I didn't set this up as a PowerPoint because I wanted it to be dynamic. So this is the company, and they have a whole lot of links on their webpage. And I can put a link to this in the chat to talk about the process. So that's it, other than to tell you that as I hear about, because I still work for AHA out of the Lexington office, and I'm down in Boston a lot. As a point of interest, I was the lead admin for taking that building that the BSA is in through LEED and getting their LEED Gold certification. Here's another photograph of the that balustrade that's being restored. And thank you for the GFRP presentation, because I'd be tempted to do that, although as a woodworker myself, I enjoy the project of trying to recreate it. Questions?
That's great.
Thanks. That's interesting.
Yeah, sounds like a game changer.
Sort of a do-it-yourself of existing conditions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was all set to go through and measure it and begin drawing and started to draw it. And then I didn't know how this would work. When I did that scan of the, there's another facet building. When I did that scan, I thought, well, this is interesting, but it's not that useful. But then when I exported it to them and they sent me back the model, that really is useful. And particularly being able to get measured drawings, because now I can begin, as you know, with old houses, laying out where you're going to do restoration and where you're going to run, like wiring has to be upgraded, things like that. And some of the drawings I saw on the GFRP presentation really impressed me, but to do a full set of measured drawings like that is a really expensive process if you're hiring somebody to do it.
Yeah.
Can't.
Yeah, another benefit for this
Never
are
would have gotten that.
I know.
buildings within the national park system that are historic houses. So another benefit is programmatic accessibility, and that like a house I'm working on Long Island, the William Floyd Estate. I'm going to show my model if there's time, but there are lots of level changes in the upstairs. It's not accessible. So a way to make it the 300-year-old occupancy of the house, part of its history, to make it all the other rooms accessible to visitors where physically they can't go. So being able to have a detailed model and panning around is a benefit too.
Yeah, it's a really easy to use tool, and the company has been very helpful. And I think, I see all kinds of applications. AHA has gone out and purchased an iPad to be dedicated to this so that we can convert it to our BIM files. Like all of this stuff, when you saw my scanned model, it picked it all up. And by the way, happy to entertain discussions. These are all shellac covered floors, and I'm sure people have lots of opinions on the best way to restore an old house like this, because I do hope to keep it as original as possible.
All right, well, let's keep in
All right.
touch.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
That's
So,
great.
yeah.
My
Sarah,
sh-
do you mind if Susan has a time crunch, so if Susan just jumps in, and then we'll go to you, Sarah, after. You're on mute, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate it. Very brief presentation, but I was very touched by how many of you have been in contact with me to ask for an update on the Mckay House in East Boston. And I have a regrettable, I believe, update, but nonetheless, timely, and I appreciate the time. I did not bring a presentation per se. I did bring one photo, in case you hadn't seen it.
Donald Mckay House.
Donald Mckay House, which was built 1844. Donald Mckay, as most of you perhaps know, was a very well-respected clipper shipbuilder. His yard was at the bottom of the hill, his house being at the very top. It must have been a spectacular view over both the inner and the outer harbor in 1844, and I could sort of envision him watching his wonderful clippers come and go. That the house is on the National Register and is a Boston landmark. Greek revival, and I think the thing that I really think is wonderfully distinctive about it is the fact that Mr. Mckay was actually Canadian, but when he built the house, he specifically had 13 columns placed on a side porch that represented the 13 original colonies. So, that's great. And I will speak about the fact that on this property, there is both a barn, which has become a problem, and most important, there is a 12,400 square foot yard. And by East Boston, that is absolutely enormous. And there lies the problem. Okay, I'll get to that. Historic Boston had put in a very reasonable offer on the house by most standards. And it was in conjunction with the East Boston Community Development Corporation that was contributing a very large Community Preservation Act funding. And the East Boston Museum would have been the first floor tenant in the house. Unfortunately, in a sense, I think, and I speak more as a community member than a preservationist for this purpose, the house was sold last month for $480 million. It was about the same offer as Historic Boston and Community Development Corporations, and it appears that it is a local owner, but quite a few of us professionally and otherwise feel that this is really a front for a developer. Two issues very quickly was the barn on the property. It was hardly remarkable. It was actually just a rebuild of an earlier one. I don't say that as an architect, but by all accounts, apparently it was even though it was certainly not 1844. It was unremarkable. I was contacted by Historic Boston about a month ago to advise me that it was going to be demolished, and was there anyone in East Boston that could perhaps retain it. Their staff at Historic Boston had assessed it and found that it was indeed repairable, and their request was that a preservation engineer actually look at the barn before it was demolished. I immediately called my state representative, Adrian Madaro, who is definitely a preservationist, lives in a house a block away, who picked up the phone, called the Commissioner of Inspectional Services, requested it be evaluated by a reservation engineer. They did not allow that, but the Commissioner of ISD did come over and authorized the demolition immediately. There was no hearing held, and I think one of the things that I really am concerned about is that several professionals in the field did indeed try to understand the legalities behind why we could not have a demolition delay hearing. I'm not sure what it would have accomplished, but I think legally that was justifiable, and apparently, from all I could do in my research, certainly should have been held. There were several places that indeed could have held it, et cetera. However, the upper part of the barn is down. I haven't been by for a couple of days. The foundation was up. And so I think the other issue, as much as it would have been good to have the barn per se, but it also, had it remained, it would have had to have been, if a developer bought the property, they would have had to use the barn presumably to put, fill in the blank number of condos or whatever in it. Which now brings us to my last point. Again, I can't emphasize, and I'm sure we have some suburbanites out there watching, 12,400 square feet is huge in East Boston, which is the fastest growing community or changing community and appreciated community in Boston. Our concern is that with the barn down, there'd probably be almost no reason that the entire lot cannot be covered with houses. I think really is the demerit to the 1844 property per se, and certainly, the house per se. And I think that in a very crowded neighborhood, smushing, again, heaven knows how many houses, condos, whatever fit in there. And I would just like to say, once again, I think this is a tried and true thing you've heard from me. I think our single strongest tool in preservation is the Zoning Board of Appeals and variances, as in no. So I'm quite sure that some of us will certainly see what indeed develops. I think we can be assured that it is nothing that is going to be wonderfully for preservation purposes. And I would certainly appreciate any thoughts that anyone has on this possible thing, but thank you again for at least letting me update you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So this is I'm sorry, is this a Mckay house at 80 White Street that you're talking about?
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Is it the most wonderful Greek revival?
Yeah.
No. However, are there talented architects who have reviewed it and have significant plans on how it would be. Some went back to 1844 as opposed to, I hate to say this, people, vinyl-sided.
Yeah.
It could be
significant
again.
significance of Donald Mckay in the world of at this age of the clipper ships.
Yeah.
And the world, the record from the Flying Cloud, for example.
Thank you for bringing up our community's favorite clipper,
Yeah.
the Flying Cloud.
Boston to San Francisco was like 89 days and 8 or 9
Yeah.
hours or something, and that record held for
Although,
into 19.
having absolutely nothing to do with the house per se, or my whining at the property, guess who actually designed most of the clipper ships? It was Mrs. White.
Oh, my God.
Apparently, the woman should be given some more credit.
Oh, okay. That's the rest of the story.
And that's.
Yeah, there you go,
Any other questions?
Yeah. Ideas, questions, suggestions?
You have my email, and
Yes.
certainly if you need to contact me,
All right.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah Wormel.
See if I can do this.
Hello.
Hear you.
Austin Popper.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Great.
Yeah.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm, because of time, I'll just like quickly go through this. So I'm working on a study of pre-1850 pauper institutions in Boston, focusing on the buildings. And the way I got started was from this image, which is published in a number of books. Anyway, it'll say House of Industry and House of Correction, South Boston, and that's all you ever find out. And you wonder, what is a house of industry? What is a house of correction? And how could there be these two very, classical, monumental looking buildings and nobody knows a thing about them? So I'd been trying to find out about them over time, found out information, but I decided to do a thorough study and write an article about them. So that's what this is, part of the article, and I'm finishing it up now. So what I'm going to be talking about are these things that came to be called institutions. And so this is from the colonial period, and I'm stopping in about 1850, because after that time, there is more photographic information. In this early period, there's practically nothing. There's no images of some of the buildings. But these institutions include things like jails, workhouses, almshouses, different kinds of hospitals. And these are institutions that were built by the city of Boston. So the very first ones were the colonial era institutions. The first that was constructed was a jail, and that was in Court Street, which is about the only thing that remains of all these institutions. That's sort of a legacy that is still called Court Street, although there's no court there. Anyway, so that was that's the one on this is a 1745 map. That was probably not the 17th century prison. It was rebuilt over time, but anyway, there was a little prison there. That's on the lower right. And then the other two institutions on the, in the center, the upper was the Alms House, and that was built in the 17th century too. And then below it was what was called a workhouse and a bridewell. And the bridewell was for, it was actually for people in the workhouse who weren't cooperating. They would go to the bridewell, and that was named in honor of the horrible English institution in London called the Bridewell. Anyway, so this is the common, and so that's right along what is today's Park Street, at Beacon Street. So this is an artist's, there's no images of these buildings, and this is an artist's idea of what they looked like with the Alms House. Nobody knows what the prison looked like, but anyway, with the Alms House and the upper left and the workhouse and bridewell below. So the next institution to be built, and possibly also you've seen this drawing, this is an alms house. So these institutions that were on the common were quite old and decrepit, and this was a replacement for the Alms House built on Leverett Street in what became the West End of Boston. It was rather undeveloped at the time. Anyway, again, a very substantial looking institution. I believe I know it's been attributed to Charles Bulfinch. I don't think that's correct. I explained in my paper why I think it was somebody else. Anyway, meanwhile, that little decrepit prison on Court Street was replaced with this jail, which was just down the street from the Alms House on Leverett Street. And it consisted of two separate prison buildings with a courthouse and keeper's house in between. And one of the reasons why there's no drawings or even photographic evidence for those things that survived into the period of photography is that these buildings were not publicly accessible any more than you'd go visit and photograph a prison today. And they were surrounded by walls, so you couldn't really see them from the street. So they were, obscure. At any rate, this was designed by Alexander Paris, and this was in the 1820s. And so this map from about 1822, 25 is a rare, evidence of these two buildings. So that's the Alms House in the upper, and then the Leverett Street Jail, because shortly after this map was made, the Alms House was demolished, and that property was sold. Now, when they demolished the Alms House on the common, near the common, and the workhouse, they didn't replace the workhouse. And so that whole population moved to the Alms House, which should not have been in the Alms House. The Alms House was for the deserving poor, and the workhouse was for the undeserving poor. So the city had no workhouse, and moreover, at this Alms House, there really wasn't a place for people to work. So they really needed a new workhouse. So the city bought a large tract of land, about 60 acres, ultimately it was, in South Boston. And this is a map that just to give you an orientation. So this was undeveloped at the time. And the idea was that the inmates of the workhouse that would be built there would work on a farm, because that was considered the most ideal form of labor for workhouse inmates. Anyway, so about 1821, 22, the workhouse was built, but eventually other institutions were built, as I'll show you. So this is, I'll show you detail, but anyway, 4 institutions were built at this site, which became known as the city institutions. So on the upper tier there is the House of Industry, a building called the Lunatic Hospital, and then a House of Correction, and the lower part is the House of Reformation. So I'll tell you about these. So this is a detail where you see the various institutions, and the House of Industry, our workhouse, is the upper left one there. Then the Lunatic Hospital, House of Correction, and then the House of Reformation. So the House of Industry was built about 1821, 22. Again, it was supposed to be for able-bodied poor. But after it was built, the city tore down the Alms House, or rather, it sold that piece of land that it was on, which had become valuable at that point, And so the entire population was moved over to the House of Industry. So it became the House of Industry Alms House again, recreating the problems that were in the Alms House. I found no image except this one of the House of Correction. This is later in the 19th century. Anyway, the House of Correction was built a couple years after the House of Industry, and it was a twin, as you saw from that drawing. It really was almost identical. It was for people at this point, people were being imprisoned rather than being killed or corporal punishment or whatever. And so these were for people who were serving less, they hadn't committed as serious crimes and they weren't committed for too long a time. The Lunatic Hospital was the next institution to be built. Oh, I should say that in the meantime, in 1826, an institution for juvenile offenders called the House of Reformation was set up, and that was put in the House of Correction. So that was a department in this building. However, it later got a separate building, as I'll mention. But the last of the separate institutions to be built was this hospital for the mentally ill, not only for mentally ill, but also people with dementia, disabled people, intellectually disabled people, and so on. And these were people who were in the Alms House and correctional, different institutions that could not handle them. And so this was built as a special facility for those people. And eventually it also took paying customers. It was a city institution, but people could put their relatives there if they needed to. So eventually these all got sold off. First, the House of Reformation, that was the first to go, and then the House of Industry. And that was because the Alms House moved to Deer Island. So this is a story of, these institutions are constantly changing at any site, as you can see. There are additions, always they had their own hospitals. There were all, work sheds for employment, all kinds of changes. And then the institutions sort of moved around, population was growing. There were changes in ideas about how to care for people. So none of them lasted very long. So here, the House of Industry was sold to a shipbuilder, in the 1850s. The hospital, the Lunatic Hospital and the House of Correction survived until the late, till the turn of the 20th century. And the House of Reformation was sold off. I have found no image of that building. I think I have something I think might be it, but there's nothing obvious anyway. And it was sold and made into lots. And the only thing that survives of this whole city property is a park that's now called Medal of Honor Park. And all this is private land now. And for all of these, there's not, a shred of legacy, except in the name of Court Street, which was the site of a courthouse and the prison. And so this is just for Jack. So I focused on City of Boston and Suffolk County institutions that the City of Boston built. Charlestown had its own Alms House, which became a city property when Charlestown was annexed. And this was the Alms House. And it was the special purpose that this was put was for elderly couples. So elderly married couples could stay together in this Alms House. And this also survived until you know, the end of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting.
I was thinking, trying to remember the Philadelphia example there, the term, was that 1820s, the term penitentiary, comes in, and the idea of it's not prison, but it's penitence, and it's performed
Yes,
sort of a.
well, that was 1790, and the first penitentiary was built, and yes, that formerly, like in the jails, and even the Alms House and the Works House, people were kept in like dorm rooms. They were big rooms, so all different kinds of people were kept together, and so it was considered a big advance to have single cells, so people didn't have to, deal with all sorts of other people. And that's the House of Correction I found did have a single cell section, and it also had a sort of dorm room section too.
Questions, thoughts?
A little tight on time for me.
All right.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of renewal of buildings, all that,
Yeah.
busyness.
Yeah. I know we're running late. Does anyone have any other things they want to share, or? All right. I just want to share something that Henry Moffett forwarded to me, just so people know that the town of Stowe is seeking an architect member to serve on a local historic district committee. So if you contact me, or I could forward that information along. Otherwise,
Thank you so
have
much.
a great summer.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Great,
Have a
great
favorite
meeting.
part.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot, and hopefully I'll
Great.
Yeah.
catch the next one then when they come up.
September 8th.
Yeah.
It comes sooner than you think.
Thank you, Susan, for facilitating.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Dan, for that.
Thanks, Jack. It was fun sitting in on this one. It's a great one. Really appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
Okay, take care.